Welcome back. We continue to look at the issue of global poverty. Now we want to turn to different arguments or different ways in which it has been argued that global poverty can be alleviated. So, in this regard, the first approach is liberal globalism. Liberal globalism suggests that what states need to do is become liberal democratic states with liberal systems, so the focus on modernization, individualism, rationalism, scientism, entrepreneurialism, etc., but also combine that with democratic systems, and that would be ensuring that you have representation, individuals get involved, they take a role in the politics and consent to the sort of governance structures that they have, and you have good working institutions that protect property and legal rights and contracts, etc. But it's also important in this regard to suggest and importantly to note that liberal globalism is also a capitalist model. So what we're really talking about is capitalist liberal democracy as the way to go in order to be able to do well in the global economy itself. Focus here, of course, is things as we've already mentioned. Private enterprise and consumer choice becomes important. The more choices people have, where to buy, where to sell, the types of jobs to have, the opportunity to start their own businesses, etc., the easier it'll be to pull populations out of poverty. And in order to ensure this as well, you need to have states that are willing to be integrated into the global economy and that they pursue free trade so that the things that they are good at, they have comparative advantage over, they basically do pursue, but things that they're not good at and may not be able to do. For example, you may not be able to make cheap milk, or you don't have the necessary technology to process oil, etc. You leave that for others to do and you buy that processed oil, but in return you sell bananas or other items that will make you foreign exchange. The idea here is that growth is good for the poor. If there is overall growing economic activity and the economy does well, the sustained economic activity will hopefully trickle down to the poorer populations. If people are doing well, then they take their money and yes, they buy boats and yachts, etc. But then they also go out to restaurants. They also put their money into hiring people to be butlers and others. They pay for services like medical care and doctors, and they give away that money to build a cancer ward, etc. So trickle down economics suggests that the rich, as if you will, benevolent benefactors, will spend in the economy, do charity, etc., and then that will bring the whole population out of poverty itself. This approach is also hostile to state intervention and protectionism, or the idea that the state should intervene to grow the economy, to encourage equality, and to redress problems of inequality, but also that states should protect their economies from foreign direct investment or foreign competitors that may push out local industries as well. Now, an approach that draws similar to this, but goes in a different way, is the global developmental approach. This approach sees the need for a developmental state, and this, of course, we can see in the modern Asian, East Asian states as well, we've seen, but it also goes back to the fact that in the initial development of both of Western states like UK and USA, etc., the state was a very important part of the building and the structure. For example, building national railroads or developing seafaring capabilities, or even after World War II in the United States, the US government did a lot to build roads and to build transportation networks and highways, etc. So what you need is a strong developmental state that develops the necessary policies and strategies that will help to grow the state, to build the infrastructure, and where necessary, to nationalize what needs to be nationalized. Maybe you need waterways nationalized. Maybe you need a giant electrification project, for example, the Tennessee Valley Authority that was created in the United States in order to rural electrify parts of the southern US. This was basically nationalizing the energy industry to a large extent and making sure the government could build rural electrification structures, as well as places like Canada, where we see, for example, socialized medicine since the 1960s, 1970s, where there is public health care and people can get the health care they need in order to go to work, etc., and don't have to worry about going for basic exams, etc. But that's basically nationalizing health care as opposed to leaving it into the free market, where if you can't afford your health care, then you suffer accordingly or die or so forth like that. The global developmentalism still also has an interest in ensuring that there are open markets, but they don't necessarily have to be open all the time, that you can have certain markets that are protected, certain areas that are nationalized, you can have certain protections of certain industries. Countries, for example, like Japan, don't allow rice to be imported or exported because it's so crucial to the diet of Japan that rice is considered a national security commodity, and the government heavily regulates the rice industry and keeps an eye on it to make sure that that basic commodity that is a staple of Japanese diet is not affected by foreign investment or an attempt to take control of the rice markets or to manipulate rice in a way that it would basically render Japan, in a sense, into a hostage to some foreign organization, etc. So they don't necessarily always see open markets and integration as useful. It can be detrimental, and this needs to be addressed by a developmental state, which also then tackles inequality and poverty itself. It is not enough to suggest that it would only be markets that will do this, that somehow foreign investment in the global political economy will find the right levels of investment and lift everybody out of poverty. Globalization has also created significant inequality, as already mentioned, in many different states, and average wealth is not the same as the actual distribution of wealth. So a developmental state has to tackle inequality and actually fight and prevent poverty and to ensure that there's growth that actually helps the poor and make sure that populations internally not only have a better distribution of wealth, but those at the bottom are lifted up through processes that the state engages with. So this leads us then to a process that suggests also that we need to look at how international organizations can do this. One way to do this, as is argued already, is questions of free trade, expanding trade agreements, and ensuring that states engage in export economies where they sell the things that they are able to produce cheaply and can produce well to others, versus importing things that's supposed to come in. So you have to have free trade. But also they assert the importance of using macroeconomic policies. For example, creating low interest situations to encourage people to borrow in order to build, but also possibly to have higher interest rates when you want to have foreign corporations come in and invest. The government can gain access to foreign investors if they say, well, if you invest in our state, the government promises to give you 6-7% on a $100 bond, etc. So you use interest rates as levers to encourage foreign investment or investment in government, etc., or to stimulate economies, etc. And government should be therefore trying to maintain good foreign exchange relations so that your people can sell products to other parts of the world, other products can come into your state that need to be needed. So for example, if you can ensure that when you sell bananas to other parts of the world, that those bananas are effectively guaranteed a certain price and you get that money back in terms of foreign exchange. But at the same time, if you need access to technology of tractors or other agricultural equipment, that you have the capacity to bring that in and get it at a good price and a stable price. It also encourages the idea that you need to reduce taxes and therefore you need to reduce the social services that rely on those taxes. If governments create economic systems that don't rely on heavy taxation, foreign investors and as well as local rich folks will keep their money in the state and therefore spend it accordingly in the state itself. So in this regard, international organizations have also now moved to the idea that what also needs to be done is to have good governance. Good governance means, again, returning to these liberal paradigms of follow the Western model, have parliamentary, presidential, or other structures, have institutions that are robust, like justice and laws, etc. And you also need to have the capacity for enforcement. And enforcement, most importantly, for someone like De Soto, for example, argues that you need good governance that holds on to private property rights. If, for example, as happened in the case of India, in Delhi, they ended up basically putting women in charge of plots of land in which they were squatting. And once they gave them title to that land, it could be just a piece of land that was 10 by 15 or whatever, they put up a shack and their whole family lives in that 10-foot by 15-foot area, or they maybe have some area here and there. When they consolidate all that property holding in the name of women, and not so much men, because they found that the men were simply willing to sell it and leave and sometimes even abandon their families, unfortunately. But if you guarantee those property rights, that those women not only own the land, they can have a place to stay, they will actually gentrify it. Some of them started to build stable structures and build a second level that you climb up with a ladder. They built sewage systems, hygiene. You could see individuals started to pay taxes and pay their electricity bill, etc., like that, and create law and order as individuals now lived there. So they wanted to make sure their communities were safe and so forth. So De Soto argues that if you have that system of property rights as just one of those institutions, and those property rights enforced, and there's reliably so, that you're going to improve the capacity, and in particular in this case of these women, to pull themselves out of poverty. So while global developmentalism pursued this throughout the 1990s, global developmentalism was pursued by international organizations through the 1990s, we should also acknowledge that this also brought in elements of global liberalism itself. The problem, however, was that it was still a focus on poverty reduction, that is, reducing the number of poor people itself in the state. But the problem is it didn't actually introduce or deal with the question of inequality reduction. So it might have lowered the number of people, for example, in parts of China and India, which we've already mentioned, where there were lower numbers of people in absolute poverty, but it didn't actually reduce the inequality. So those people may be out of a certain level of poverty, but they still remained poor relative to the rest of the society and the rest of the economy as well. The strategy, of course, here is the idea that the poor should gain the same access as the rich. So access to education, healthcare, etc., which if it's in markets mean as long as they can pay for it, they can access it. But it doesn't actually prevent relative inequality because not everybody can pay for education, healthcare, access to housing, etc., like that. And this actually increases the divide. Consider, for example, if you have a situation like has been happening in Toronto and a number of other Western countries, and including different major cities in Canada as well, that you do have access to the marketplace. More people can buy houses because there's more houses, there's mortgage systems, elaborate banking, etc., that allows people to access houses. But the reality is fewer people can actually afford to buy a house, not just because it's supply, but because they wouldn't qualify for a mortgage. So giving access may not be enough, as international organizations have been pushing largely for access. They still have not addressed the question of inequality, which actually gives rise to the problem of global poverty itself. So with that, I'm going to thank you for engaging, and we'll catch you at the next video.